to Converge. You guys for being here. So glad. Caleb said this when he was welcoming everyone. You know, the four of you that were here for that. But just so true. But you know, we debated a while back. Do we start doing message first and then worship? We tried it one week. We're like, no one's there at the beginning, so let's not do that. But you know, he said, you know, we do this for a specific reason every Thursday night, and that is so that we can connect with people who are our own age, worship together, and you know, he also said, you know, sometimes we don't necessarily want to be in moments, but then we get there, we realize, you know, I'm glad in that moment, and for me, worship is often that moment. It's like, I just could be doing something else that may seem more productive, and then I get in a moment where I'm encountering the presence of God in a moment of worship, and I just say, I don't think I want to be anywhere else other than right here. And so I'm glad. So thank you guys who are here. And we're going to get a chance to worship a little bit later this evening again. If you are new here and don't know me, my name is Kenny. So look around the room, I think everyone knows me. But just in case, Kenny and a part of the staff team here at Mosaic Church get a chance to hang out here on Wednesdays with our high school students and Thursdays with our young adults. We have been in a series called thatcloudtho. And so if you take any photos, make sure you hashtag it, hashtag thatcloudtho, hashtag converge, hashtag get it. And so we're in a series going through the book of Hebrews. If you are unfamiliar with the book of Hebrews as a whole, if you've never read through it, I would highly encourage for you to do that. The book of Hebrews was written to a group of Jewish Christians. Jesus came to earth, lived on planet earth amongst the Jewish people, ends up dying, resurrects from the dead. True story, I know, cool. And the Jewish people end up, the church becomes the epicenter for the start of Christianity. And they are now facing massive persecution and massive problems in the Jewish church. And so it's about 30 years or so roughly after Jesus has ascended to heaven. And the church has been growing greatly throughout the Gentile world, throughout the known world. But the people in Jerusalem, the Christians there, the Hebrew Christians, the Jewish Christians, are going through massive persecution and massive oppression from the Roman government predominantly. And so the Christians now are also getting massive oppression from the Jews, from the Jewish leadership, and now beginning around this time, around 60 to 65 AD, from some of the Roman government as well. And so the writer of Hebrews, the author of this book, this letter, writes a letter to kind of remind the people that are facing some of the troubles they're facing, to remind them to live for Jesus and to encourage them, to give them the tools they need to live for Jesus day in and day out. And early on in the book, and the first couple chapters in Hebrews, the author's talking quite a bit first about the fact that Jesus is God, the deity of Christ. He wasn't just an angel. He wasn't just some really cool rabbi, really cool teacher. He was actually God. Off his throne, stepped down in human flesh and walked among us. This is what theologians today call the hypostatic union. The idea that he is both 100% man and 100% God. That's 200%. That's not mathematically possible. Right? He wasn't half God, half man. Okay, it wasn't like, it wasn't like the way Hercules was or something like that. Right? No, he was actually 100% God at all times and 100% human, exactly the way we are today. Jesus was that way. This is the hypostatic union. It's sort of a paradox. It makes my brain hurt when you try to think about it. But it is true. And the writer of Hebrews takes the first chunk of his letter to remind everyone. I want to make it very clear, you know this. It's not just an angel that we're talking about here. We're talking about the creator and sustainer of everything. The God of the universe. The master, the king, walking among you. And I think this is really important because when you recognize how valuable something is, it causes you to treat it differently. You know, can you imagine if someone says to you, hey, I'm going to give you a car and I'm going to give you a free car and you can have it. You can go, okay, well, thanks. That's awesome. I appreciate that. And you may value it a certain amount. But then when someone tells you, hey, by the way, it's a brand new BMW Z4 Roadster and it's got a retail value of $130,000. That's my favorite car that I'll never drive. That's all right, you know, silver, black racing stripes, leather interior, Tiptronic transmission, 6 speed. Anyway, that would be my favorite. But anyway, if someone were to say to you, hey, I'm going to give you a car, and this is the car I'm going to give you, I'm going to go, well, wait a minute. My value, my level of appreciation for that vehicle goes up once I realize what it really is. And the writer of Hebrews is saying the same thing to us. Don't forget who we're talking about here. We're talking about God. The God-man. Like the one where God was incarnate. Like, did you forget who you were worshiping here? Lest you have forgotten, let me remind you. And that demands a response. That inspires us and encourages us to honor and value Christ more. And then throughout the book of Hebrews, he begins to address some of the persecution, some of the oppression. He's reminding them, don't give up meeting together. Christians should get together on a regular basis to gather to worship together, to hear preaching, to have communion together, to have fun together. These things should happen regularly because they keep us strong in the face of persecution. So we should remember that Jesus is God, and remember that we should get around together regularly. That should be a part of our lives. And then he talks about the importance of the Word of God. And he begins to teach some really heavy doctrines. In fact, the book of Hebrews is one of the more difficult books of the Bible to really understand. One of the more difficult books of the Bible because it deals with some of the more difficult, more profound theological concepts throughout Scripture. And he's teaching these things, and the author is going through, and he talks quite a bit about people who have fallen away, people who were a part of the community of God and now have walked away because they wanted to go back to the Jewish system because they believed they weren't necessarily good enough and they had to do something to earn their salvation. So they started walking away. And some people who came into the fold and were part of the church, and they couldn't hack it. It was just too hard to be a Christian. So they started leaving the community of God. And he talks through some very key doctrines and dealing with these people who have appeared to have been in the faith and then fallen away. And then he talks again in chapter 7 and 8 about some of the persecution and teaches some more doctrine. And he goes into chapter 8 and 9 talking about the importance of the understanding atonement, which is the fact that Jesus, the God-man, the King of the universe, comes down and he dies, where our sins are transferred to him and his perfection is transferred to us through faith. And he uses the Old Testament for it. In the Old Testament, they would take an animal into the temple, and they would say a prayer, and God would transfer the innocence of an animal to the humans, and the sin of the human to the animal. And then they would kill the animal, and sin would have been punished. Because the animal was guilty, forensically speaking, guilty, and then punished for it, and we as humans are now declared innocent. And so in Hebrews chapter 9, he talks about that. And then in Hebrews 10, he goes back to unfolding some more doctrines and some deeper concepts. And begin again to talk about the people who were a part of the faith, but they walked away. It's because they didn't understand these doctrines. They walked away because they didn't embrace the fact that they were declared innocent. Just like the people in the Old Testament were declared innocent through animal sacrifice. And in Hebrews it says, if an animal being declared innocent, or if an animal being killed could bring you innocency, how much more does the God of the universe being sacrificed on your behalf bring innocency to you? If a lamb could bring some innocency into your life, how much more does the King of the universe dying on your behalf bring innocency into your life? And then in Hebrews chapter 10, at the very end, in reference to those who had fallen away, the author of Hebrews says this, "But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed." We're not a part of that crowd, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. We're amongst the people who have faith in God, and we preserve our souls. And then he goes into Hebrews chapter 11. And this is the chapter we've been going through for the last 2 months. And the author of Hebrews begins to kind of outline what we often refer to as the Hall of Faith. And basically, it's kind of just a list of people who have done awesome things. And it kind of goes through the history of humanity and the Jewish people. Starts off with the guys like Adam or Abel, and he talks about Abel and Cain. God creates the universe, puts Adam and Eve in the garden. We don't know how long they're in the garden before they sin, but we know that eventually they sin. And for between that time, they end up having kids at Abel and Cain kills Abel because he's jealous of him, and Abel was acceptable before God, and Cain was not. And then we go several generations to a guy named Enoch. We don't know much about the time frame of humanity between Abel and Enoch, but Enoch, walked with God, and God just took him up, and he was no more. And then a few generations later, this guy named Noah appears on the scene, and Noah ends up building this massive ark, and God brings flood waters and rain and wipes out all of humanity. Of close to 1 billion people, scholars tell us, were on planet Earth at that time, and wipes out all of them, and Noah and his family are saved. And then Noah ends up making some mistakes after that, and several generations go on, and he ends up having it to the 10th generation. This guy named Abraham shows up on the scene. This guy Abraham had made all kinds of mistakes in his life, but he ends up believing God. And the Bible says he was credited to him as righteousness. And we talked about that a few weeks back. And he ends up having a son named Isaac. And he has this awesome experience where God asks him to sacrifice Isaac. And then we talked about Isaac's two sons, Jacob and Esau, and what God did with Aaron. And the writer of Hebrews begins to talk about all these things these people did. And they did it by faith. Not because they were good people, not because they earned it, but because they chose to believe. God empowered them to believe, and they responded by saying, God, I believe that you are real, and I trust who you are. I trust that your love, your innocence, your righteousness is good enough for me. Because he's coming off in Hebrews chapter 10 talking about 9 and 10, the people, they didn't understand they were declared innocent. They tried to do it in their own power. It was too hard. They walk away from the faith. So he's saying, hey, remember all these people? They didn't do it in their own power. They did it by faith. And then he talks about Joseph, who we discussed a few weeks back. And then Joseph ends up as a slave in Egypt in these incredibly unfair circumstances, but it's the sovereign hand of God. God's in control, leading him into Egypt. And eventually, about 400 years passes, and Joseph's descendants, several million people, are enslaved or living in extreme poverty for little wages in the nation of Egypt. And eventually, God brings a guy named Moses that many of us know about. And Moses comes and eventually leads them out into the wilderness, out of Egypt. About 2 or 3 million Israelites in the nation of Israel at this time. And they go into the wilderness out of Egypt. And God ends up, the original idea was that God would take them into what is called the Promised Land, what is modern day Israel and parts of Palestine. The Promised Land. And God had been promising the Promised Land for several generations, for several hundred years. God, in fact, for almost 1,000 years, dating back, God had been promising people that this land, he makes the covenant with Abraham and everyone after him. He says, this land is going to belong to the Jewish people. It's going to belong to the Hebrew people. And in this land, amongst the Hebrew people, I'm going to bring forth the rescuer of the world, Jesus, the Messiah. And as they come out of out of Egypt and toward the Promised Land, they should have gone directly in, but there's some disobedience and some sin. And so God drives them or leads them out into the desert, and they wander around for 40 years. And God says, the adults who were leading Israel, when they come out of Egypt, I'm going to wait till all of them die off. And after they've all died off, I will raise up a new generation of leaders, and they will lead my people back into the Promised Land. And they will finally have a nation of their own. Something they had never had in their history. And as they approach this time, 40 years has gone by since Moses has led them out. Moses has passed away. There's a new guy that comes to the fold, a guy named Joshua. And Joshua leads them to the banks of the Jordan River. And they're on the Jordan River. And about 5 miles away is a city called Jericho. Now Jericho was the forefront of commerce, politics of the world at that time in terms of cross-cultural connection. Egypt was the world's superpower at the time, but Egypt was very kind of self-focused and sort of self-sustaining. Jericho really was the center of all trade and commerce internationally. Jericho was right at the crossroads of the two busiest, most used roads in the known world at that time. The Via Maris Road and the King's Highway down to Egypt. It took people from Egypt all the way to Asia, or from Asia Minor all the way through to what is modern day Eastern Europe. And it was kind of like the Manhattan of its day. And so God says, I want my people to go in, and you're going to take over Jericho. Now, you can imagine the people of Israel going, we've been slaves all our lives. All right, well, we were slaves before that when we were little kids. And now we've been wandering around the desert. We don't know a whole lot. And I think we often talk about Jericho being a strong, awesome, powerful nation. And it was a strong, powerful city. However, for a moment, let's view it from Jericho's perspective. I think there are some interesting things we learn if we view it from kind of Jericho's perspective. Can you imagine if people are traveling from Egypt to the Eastern world on a regular basis, and Jericho is the place to stop. There's lots of inns and kind of motel there. There's trading that goes on there. This is the hub for commerce. People from Egypt would have been traveling through and would have at some point would have said, did you hear what happened with the Jews? Yeah, their God brought 10 plagues upon us. Yeah. Where are they now? I don't know. We haven't seen them in a couple of years. They've been wandering around in the desert out there a couple miles away. Are you kidding me? Yeah. They brought 10 plagues. And that we hear that God says He's going to give them your land. Can Can you imagine if you're in Jericho for a moment and you hear this? Think about that for a moment. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 27 says this, by faith he left Egypt, referring to Moses, not being afraid of the anger of the king, he endured as seeing who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. Verse 29, by faith the people crossed the Red Sea on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. If you're not familiar with the story, Moses leads the people out of Egypt. They come to the Red Sea. The Egyptians have changed their mind. Why should we let them go? They're running after them, and literally the waters split. And they begin to walk across dry land. Between 2 and 3 million people walking across dry land. Can you just imagine that for a moment? Like you're walking on dry land and you look to your left and it's just like a wall of water. Wow, that's pretty cool. Like at any point, like you're kind of afraid, like, I don't know, I'd be like running. I'd like to believe I'm like a man of faith and be like, God's going to hold back the whole time. I'd be like running so fast in case like God changed his mind. I don't know. Maybe I got like I don't know. I mean, I don't know what I would do in that moment. I've never been a part of water being split, so I don't know. Can you imagine like he's going, they're walking, and then they get to the Outer Banks and to the other side of the Red Sea, and the Egyptians are chasing them, and God closes the water up and closes the Red Sea, and he drowns them all. Can you imagine what you've seen? Now, if you're the people of Israel, you're the nation of Israel, you're the Jewish people, you've seen what God did, bringing 10 plagues upon the Israelites, or upon the Egyptians, for not letting them go, keeping them enslaved. The last of the plagues was the death of the firstborn of every family in Egypt, the death of the firstborn in the families. And so you look and say, man, this is pretty wild what God has been doing. And then they end up sinning and being disobedient, so God takes them into the wilderness, never 40 years. But every morning they wake up, and there's like bread raining down, manna, this bread that's just literally raining down. And they wake up every morning and there's food to eat. And every night when the sun goes down, there's a pillar of fire. And they're wandering around the desert for 40 years. True story. Actually happened. Like, seriously, who needs a flashlight? You have a pillar of fire. Okay? And then you come to the Jordan River. And this is 40 years later after the Red Sea. They come to the Jordan River. And Joshua is telling that he's now the new leader, taking over for Moses. And he's talking to the people and going, we're going to cross over and take Jericho. Can you imagine what they're thinking right now? I remember I was a kid when those things happened, right? They're now adults. These were the little kids when the Egyptian stuff was happening. Now these are the adults in the generation. They're going, I remember that moment when the water closed up on the Egyptians. I was a little kid. I was holding my mama's hand, and we were looking back, and we were seeing the water. I remember that, right? And Joshua was saying to them, and we're going to go to the book of Joshua in a second, but Joshua reminds them, remember what God did? Remember what God did. When you face a moment that seems impossible, the first step is to look and say, remember what God did. Remember what God did there? Remember what God did there? I remember what God did there. And there's instantly this encouragement, this confidence rises inside of us. It's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to do through Hebrews chapter 11. These are Christians, Jewish Christians living in Jerusalem as they read this. And literally every day the Pharisees and some of the Jewish leadership are dragging them out and murdering them. Or the Romans are coming in and dragging them out and murdering them. They're dying by the hundreds and in some instances possibly the thousands. Men, women, children. Beaten, tortured. This is happening around 62 to 65 AD in the first century. So the writer of Hebrews writes this to remind them. Listen, I know you just watched your sister get dragged out of your house and stoned to death a moment ago. I know you just watched that happen. I'm going to remind you the God that you serve. And then they cross over again God splits the water, the Jordan River, the waters come up, and they cross over. Now, they cross the river and they end up encamping right there. They're about 5 miles away. Remember, there's no street lights. There's no I-4 lights, right? It doesn't work that way. It's not like iDrive or neon lights going on all night long. No. It's pitch black dark when the sun goes down. Except, if you're living in Jericho, for the last several years, you've seen people camp on the other side of the Jordan River about 5 miles away. I can assure you, you can see the pillar of fire from 5 miles away. So you think, for the last 38 years or so, I've grown up in Jericho, and from afar I see a fire every night. And I keep hearing rumors that their God has promised them my land. It's a little bit scary. And then I hear that God brought a plague of locusts and a plague of frogs and eventually kills the firstborn of everyone in Egypt for not treating the Israelites properly. Wow, I better be cautious. I think sometimes I've heard preachers say, like, the Jerichos I bet they were afraid. In fact, the scriptures tell us they were afraid. Let's get to that in a second. Verse 11:30 says this, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. So God tells the Israelites, I want you to go into your Jericho, I want you to march around it once a day for 6 days. And on the 7th day, you're going to march around 7 times and blow your trumpet. Now, the city of Jericho, we know, was probably somewhere like 10 to 12 acres, not a very large city, but had these massive city walls. Archaeologists tell us walls are about 30 to 40 feet high and were extremely wide, strong, a very well fortified city. There was a gate that would open that was well guarded. People would come in and out of the city, but it was well guarded and there was a control of traffic coming in and out of the city. And so they show up, they have this strong army, but they've got to be afraid because the Jews are showing up. And rather than attacking, the Jews just, talk about 2 million people just marching around the city. Just marching around the city one time, and then they go back to their camp. If you're in Jericho the first day, you see them coming, and you're ready to fight, and they just walk around you, and then they leave. What the heck was that all about? Then the second time, and then the 7th day, they march around 7 times, they blow their trumpets, and the walls literally fall down. They just go into the ground. And then the Israelites are able to go in and they take over the city. Verse 31 says this, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Let me turn back with me to the book of Joshua. Let me unpack this woman named, if you go in the Mosaic Bibles there, it's on page 115, Joshua chapter 2. This woman named Rahab, she's mentioned in the Bible 3 times in our New Testament. Once in Hebrews, once in Matthew, and then once in James. But I want to kind of unpack her story for a second and how that relates to the story of God that's been unfolding all the way from Cain and Abel, all the way down through the patriarchs, through Joseph, through Moses, through the time of the wilderness, and now as they come to take over Jericho. They had come out of the wilderness. They're in the wilderness for 38 years or so, close to 40 years in that time frame. They've now crossed over the Jordan River. And before they go and march, before they take over the city, Joshua sends in spies. Now, if you don't know the story, several years earlier, 40 years earlier, Joshua and 11 other dudes got sent to the land. So after they cross in the Red Sea, Moses brings some guys together and says, okay, you 12, you're going to go into Jericho in the land of Canaan, and you're going to do some spy work, some reconnaissance work for us. You're going to go in there and check it out, and you're going to kind of Navy SEAL work, and they're going to go in, and they're going to scope it out. And when they came back, 10 of the 12 had said, there's giants in the land. They're too big, they're too strong. We could never take them. And that's one of the reasons why their lack of faith is why God sent them into the wilderness. There was 2 of the 12 that said, we could take them. Not because we're great, but because we have God. Did you guys forget it? Like, literally, just think about this for a moment. They just saw the Egyptians, the strongest superpower in the world, get taken down. They cross the Red Sea, and they go, those guys are too big for us. Because they forgot what just happened a moment ago. And Joshua's going, do you guys remember what happened? Were you guys with me? Have you guys seen the man that comes out every morning? Have you seen the pillar of fire at night? And I may want to get mad at those guys. At the end of the day, I'm probably just as guilty as those guys. How often do I face a situation in my life and I doubt God? And someone wants to go to me, do you not remember what God just did? Have you forgotten? That's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to, in Hebrews, he's trying to remind them. Look what God has done. How can we possibly forget? It's not about us. Well, Joshua was one of those 2. He's a young man. Well, fast forward 40 years. Now he comes and he's like, okay, I remember we sent 12 spies, and there were only me and Caleb were the only ones. Right, Joshua and Caleb were the only 2 dudes that gave a positive report. The other 10 didn't have confidence. And Joshua's going, okay, I'm going to do it a little differently. Rather than making a big, kind of telling all of Israel what we're doing, I'm going to do it in secret. So he grabs just 2 dudes. Doesn't tell anyone. And says, okay, I want you to go into Jericho, scope it out, and come back. And I bet he was pretty selective of who he chose. because he remembers what happened 40 years ago. He's like, listen, dude, I don't got time to go back in the wilderness. Hashtag, anybody got time for that? All right, I've been there. I'm ready to take some promised land. Joshua chapter 2 says this, verse 1. And Joshua, son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly as spies. Drinking some water, excuse me. Go view the land, especially Jericho. And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. Now, Jericho, powerful city, commerce, Manhattan, surely they've got lots of houses where men could stop and use the services of a prostitute. And so, in fact, it is most theologians and scholars believe that Rahab wouldn't have just been a regular prostitute. She probably would have been kind of the madam over several prostitutes in the way, because she was the controller of that home. So she probably would have been not just herself a prostitute, but overseeing a house full of prostitutes. And so these 2 dudes come there. What else is new? Dudes go to prostitutes. That's what they do. They stayed there. It says, and lodged there. Verse 2 says this, and it was told to the king of Jericho, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. So at some point now, think about it. This is a city of hundreds of thousands of people with tens of thousands of people coming in and out on a daily basis. All right? How do they notice these 2 dudes? I know how they notice these 2 dudes. Because for the last 38 to 40 years, they've seen a pillar of fire every night across the way, 5 miles away, going, those are the Jews. Those are the Jews. This is their promised land. We're in their land. And they were looking at them every night, and they're afraid of those guys. And so when 2 Jews show up, they notice, those are Jews. And they're afraid. Wouldn't you be afraid? I see a pillar of fire. Are you kidding me? I'd be like, here's the keys, dude. You can have the house. You can't have it. Say it, though. Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out the land. Verse 4. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and said, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. She lied. Now, some people, there are whole theological books written about the fact, should she have lied, should she have not, was it wrong, was it sin? At the end of the day, you're a prostitute, you're following fake gods, and you've heard about this real God. At the end of the day, you know these dudes are legit, you're going to do whatever it takes to protect them. She lied. Was it right or wrong? It's not the point. The point is that God orchestrated someone to protect the 2 spies. Does that mean you should lie? No. Rahab didn't have the law. Right? The 10 Commandments had been given to the Jews while they're in the wilderness. And that hadn't been spread yet. Only the Jews know about that. You are only held accountable to what you know. At the end of the day. You're held accountable to what you know. And you know it's wrong to lie. So you shouldn't lie. That's it. Random side note, people ask, well, what about the people in Africa and Asia, Central Asia that never heard about Jesus? The book of Romans says that our conscience tells us, whether you've heard of Jesus or not, our conscience tells us what's right or wrong. And so when you sin, you're sinning against your conscience. People who are in Central Asia or Northern India or Africa and have never heard the gospel, they don't have the law. But Ecclesiastes 3:11 tells us that eternity is written on our hearts. We know ultimately what is right or wrong from inside. And when we betray our conscience, we've sinned. So Rahab may or may not necessarily have known lying was right or wrong, but she ultimately knew good from evil in the general sense, in the transcendent sense. And everyone in the world knows that, and they're held accountable for that. So when you sin against your conscience, when you sin against knowing what's right, then you're held accountable for that. So it's not unjust for someone who's never heard of Jesus to be separated from God forever. Rahab didn't know it was wrong to lie. She lied. Maybe she did. I don't know. It doesn't matter. This is the point. Verse 5 says, and when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I do not know where the men went. She tells them, pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them. She's like, listen, they were here. She's like, what's new? Guys, come to me. That's what I do. Duh. Right? Hashtag duh. And so Rahab's like, yeah, they came. We did our thing. They paid me, and then they left. They're out the gate. Why are you here? They're running. Go chase them. Don't come talk to me. I'm a prostitute. You're the king. Right? I can just imagine. Maybe she didn't say it like that. I don't know. But she had brought them, verse 6 says this, but she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. So the men pursued after them on the way to Jordan as far as the fords, and the gate was shut down as the pursuers had gone out. But the men laid down, and she came up on the roof and said to them, this is what she says, this is in verse 9. This is unbelievable what she says to them. This gives us great insight into what the people of Jericho were probably thinking. She says this, I know that the Lord has given you the land. So at some point, it was circulated. The people in Jericho, they knew the Jews believed it was their promised land. I know that the Lord has given you the land. And she agreed with it. Was she living a life of great righteousness? She was a prostitute. In that, she's a woman, which have no value in that culture. She's a prostitute. Right? People will look at her and say, you're dirty, you're disgusting, you're amongst the worst of the bunch. You're a sexual, immoral person. You're exploiting men. Whatever you want to say. You're the madam over other women. You're exploiting young women. I mean, there can be all sorts of things that say, this woman is gross. She's disgusting. And quite frankly, she was. She was repugnant. She was a disgusting sinner. And so were you. You see, we want to look at Rahab and say, look how gross a prostitute is, but I'm just as repugnant. Me, by myself, apart from Jesus, I'm just as bad. In fact, I think I'm worse than any prostitute I've ever met. I haven't met many, I'm just saying. That's all video. Never been to a prostitute. Just kidding. Never been to a strip club either. Thank you, Jesus. Done a lot of stupid things in my life, but I've never done those things. But the reality is that stupid things I have done are just as bad or worse. Verse 9 says this, I know that the Lord has given you the land. She agrees with the truth, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. So we're all afraid of you guys. But it's funny that the rest of the people in Jericho want to kill them and come against them. Only one person in Jericho says, here's the right response. I'm kind of afraid of you, but I recognize that you follow the one true God. And I'm going to treat you fair. I'm going to treat you in a certain way. Verse 10, for we have heard that the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea. Can you imagine? She's going, hey, we heard 40 years back that the water of the sea was dried up. Where have you guys been the last 40 years hanging out there? Why haven't you guys come and taken the city already? Right? Can you imagine what's going through her mind? She's having this encounter with the two Jewish spies. He dried up the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. And what you did with the two kings of the Amorites. Right? The Jews come in and they end up, as they cross the Jordan River, before they go to Jericho, they fight some of the kings and they slaughter in a kind of a mini battle preemptively before Jericho. They end up killing some Amorites. And they're like, we know what you guys did. This is amazing. Look what happened at the Red Sea. You guys were able to take out these Amorites. We're afraid of the Amorites. Amorites, theologians and scholars, archaeologists tell us the Amorites were the giants of the land. They were the ones that people believe were 9 to 12 feet tall, were super strong. Maybe derivatives from the Nephilim we talked about a couple weeks back. I mean, these are the people in fact, that's why Jericho's had these walls that were so tall, because they were afraid of the Amorites. They're like, you took them out. Why have you been waiting to come there? She's like, we're afraid of you. Now then, she says to them, now then, please, verse 12, or excuse me, verse 11. As soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, He is the God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. This is a prostitute in Jericho, in a pagan land, looking at the people of God saying, we know who your God is, and we're pretty darn afraid of Him. Verse 12, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you will also deal kindly with me in my father's house, and give me a sure sign. She says, hey, listen, I've treated you kindly, I hid you from the king, and she ends up helping them orchestrate a way for them to get out of the city and get back to Joshua and the camp safely. She goes, before you leave, swear to me. Swear to me that you will treat me kindly, the way I've treated you kindly. And they make a promise, and they tell her, take a scarlet rope and hang it out the window. And when the Jews come in, and they march around, the seventh day, they march 7 times, everything falls down except one portion of the wall, where Rahab's place was. Rahab's house. Rahab's inn. I don't know what it was called back then, whatever it was called. So a couple of things I think from Rahab we learn. Eventually the spies escape. They go to a different direction based on Rahab's. She says, listen, I'm going to throw them off. They're going to go toward the Jordan River where your people are looking for you. You go to the opposite direction. Wait 3 days and then circle back. And they follow her direction. They make it back safely. They're able to outrun or escape from the Jericho men that were chasing them. And they finally get back. And can you imagine Joshua's waiting for the report? He's been waiting 40 years for this. Right? He was one of the guys. He had been there before, 40 years earlier. He was one of the original spies. And these two guys come back to him. And he's waiting, chomping at the bit. Like, what's the information? Give me what you got. And he goes, so do they have lots of guards? Yeah, they have lots of guards. Okay, well, did they have like the machinery and like so they can take us out? Yeah, probably, yeah. And they're big. To tell us, yeah, they're big. Here's their response. This is their response to Joshua. Chapter 2, verse 24. And they said to Joshua, they have an encounter with Rahab, and then they leave. And they say this, truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands. They just had an encounter where they were reminded the power of God. And also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. They're afraid of us, Joshua. And Joshua goes and courageously leads the people of Israel toward Jericho. They take over the land, and eventually that becomes the epicenter for the Jewish people. And they go through a time of what's called the Judges, of more than 200 years, where there's no leader at all. It's just a kind of a democratic, social democratic system where they work together. And finally, they reject that and they choose a king, and God brings them a king, Saul, and he's a wicked king. And then God brings another king named David. David, however, comes to us through a very unique lineage. If you go through Matthew chapter 1, turn there in Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1, verse 2. Matthew chapter 1, verse 2 says this. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah. It goes to Judah, it goes to Perez, it goes to Hezron, it goes to Ram, it goes all the way down the list, and it comes down to verse 4, and it goes to Nahshon, the father of Salmon. It's not salmon, because it's a Greek word, so it's salmon, or Salmon, okay? Not salmon, Salmon. And Salmon was the father of Boaz by Rahab. And Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And so the Jews are hanging out by the Jordan River, waiting for the spies to get back. They come back and they say there's this prostitute named Rahab. And she believes. She agrees that our God is the one true God. And she dealt kindly with us. And she took risk. She risked her own life for us. And she believes. And eventually the Jews come in and take over Jericho. Everyone is wiped out except Rahab and her family. But eventually, one of the guys in the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Judah, the line of the Messiah to come, marries this prostitute Rahab. And she becomes the great-great-grandmother of this guy named David that we know much about. And eventually David brings us the lineage of the Messiah, the rescuer, Jesus the Christ. Rahab's story is phenomenal to me in a couple different ways. But I think the biggest thing that stands out to me about Rahab is the fact that she was a prostitute, and it would have been easy for her to say, just like everyone in Jericho, I'm a prostitute, I'm a lowlife, I'm dirty, I'm a nobody. Rahab shouts to us that no one is ever too far for God to use. Rahab's life shouts to us that if you are willing to trust in Jesus, doesn't matter what you've done, doesn't matter who's around you, that if you will remember who God is, He will rescue you and He'll bring you into the story that He is writing. That He's been writing for all of eternity. All through the Jewish history, He's writing this awesome story that the writer of Hebrews through chapter 11 is recounting for us. This awesome, beautiful story of person after person after person we've gone through the last 2 months. Just these incredible stories that God's done these awesome things. And you know, it's easy for us to say, but Abraham was awesome, and Isaac was awesome, and Jacob was awesome. But then we have a prostitute from a pagan land, and God goes, oh yeah, you think I just used Abraham in a great faith? You think I just used Noah who has great faith? No, I even use prostitutes from pagan lands. And they do the exact same thing that Abraham did. I rescue them, and I bring them into my story. Why? I have a plan. And I am rescuing the world. You are never too far from the love and grace of God. No matter how many times you failed, no matter how many times you've blown it, no matter how many times you said, I don't care if you looked at porn for 2 hours today. I don't care if you gossiped today about someone. I don't care if you stole money from someone today. You are not too far from the hand and grace of God. You're like, but I forgot. Just like the Jews, people who forgot who God was over and over and over again. And it doesn't just stop there all throughout for the next 1,000 years before Jesus shows up. They continually forget who God is and how awesome He is. And you go, I forgot who God was. Even today I doubted God. Today I doubted whether God is even real. Today I doubted my salvation. Today I doubted. If that's you, God says, hey, if tonight you choose to remember who I am, if you choose to acknowledge as Rahab did, that's the one true God, I wipe the slate clean. I wipe it clean, and I bring you right back into the story that I've been writing all along. You are never, ever, ever, ever too far from the hand and grace of God. Before we finish up in some response worship tonight, I want to show you a video. It's one of my favorite contemporary pastors is a guy named Matt Chandler. He's a pastor at a large church in Dallas, Texas. And he's also the president of the Acts 29 network. It's a network of churches that Mosaic is a part of now. Matt Chandler is one of my favorite preachers, and I've listened to a bunch of his sermons and watched a bunch of his videos on YouTube. A couple years ago, I came across a video that grabbed my heart in a way that no other sermon, I think, had grabbed my heart. He's talking about, it's a sermon from a conference he did a couple years ago, and he's talking about how he was new to the faith and new to Christianity, but it didn't take long before he began to be frustrated with the way modern-day Christians do things. He was frustrated with the modern church before he was even a pastor. And he was frustrated, and he tells this story about a pastor that in his mind was a terrible preacher and just did and said some stupid things. And he had reached out to this woman who was in a sexually immoral relationship, brings her to church, and they were kind of trying to share the gospel with her, and he brings her to church one night, and the preacher just says and does something super stupid and pisses him off, and what rises up inside of him is, I believe, righteous anger inspired by the gospel. And so I'm going to ask you, they're going to show that video, and then as soon as the video's over, the team will come and lead us in worship.